Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive.
Hmm.
Today we're going to be talking about Baltimore,
Okay.
specifically two projects there,
Mm.
Station East and the Highway to Nowhere.
Yeah.
And at first glance, they seem very different. One is considered a success story, revitalization.
Yeah.
The other one, a cautionary tale.
Mm.
But when you look a little deeper,
Right.
there's actually,
A lot more going on.
yeah, there's a lot more complexity than you might think on the surface.
Yeah.
So we're going to unpack all that. We're going to be talking about leaky roofs, a highway that leads literally to nowhere, and even a battle over historic tax credits.
Should be a good one.
Yeah, by the end of this deep dive, hopefully you'll know a little bit more about how to evaluate these big projects and how they affect communities.
Yeah. I think what's so interesting about these two projects is that they both really get at the heart of some of the challenges and complexities of urban renewal. These questions of who benefits, who gets left behind when we try to, revitalize a community.
Yeah, yeah. And what does that word even mean? What
Ah.
does revitalize even mean?
Right.
Exactly.
So, why don't we just jump right in? Let's start with the highway to nowhere. I mean, this isn't just a road that goes nowhere. This is really like a physical scar running through West Baltimore. And it's a story of broken promises and displacement.
Yeah, it is. And it's a 1.39-mile stretch of unfinished highway. And it really stands as this reminder, I think, of the impact of urban renewal policies and how those
Hmm.
have affected predominantly black neighborhoods in Baltimore for decades.
Hmm.
The project started in the 1940s. It was part of this big plan to connect the suburbs to downtown Baltimore via this, big expressway.
So this is a time when, like, cities all over the country are embracing the car, and
Yeah.
building these huge highway systems.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is where, someone like Robert Moses comes into the picture.
Mm.
He was a huge figure in urban planning, known for these, big ideas and a pretty forceful way of getting things done.
Yeah, I've heard that name.
Wow.
He's responsible for a lot of the highways and bridges in New York City. Yeah, that's right. And he actually put out this report, the Baltimore Arterial Report. And in it, he laid out this plan for this big expressway system that would cut right through the middle of several predominantly black neighborhoods in West Baltimore.
That must have been met with a lot of resistance.
Well, it was. But at first it wasn't enough to stop the project. They actually started demolition in the late 1960s. And over the next few years, they demolished over 900 homes, 60 businesses, and displaced more than 2,800 people.
Wow. I mean, that's just hard to even fathom, that many people displaced.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about entire blocks, bulldozed families forced to relocate, the whole social fabric of these neighborhoods just ripped apart. And all of this was happening in the name of progress, this assumption that these neighborhoods were blighted and expendable.
Right. So it's like what you were saying before about who benefits and who gets left behind. This is a prime example of that.
Yeah, and the irony of it all is that they never even finished this expressway. Due to more and more community opposition and then shifting priorities, the project was eventually stopped. And they were left with this 1.39-mile stretch of highway that leads to absolutely nowhere. Hence the name, the Highway to Nowhere.
Right. So not only were these communities uprooted and displaced, but they're also left with this, literal physical scar.
Yeah.
That's a constant reminder of what was lost.
Exactly. And the impact of the Highway to Nowhere, it continues even today. The residents in these communities have much longer commute times compared to, wealthier white neighborhoods. And that demolition that happened contributed to increased poverty crime and just this feeling of abandonment in these areas.
Like a perfect example of the unintended consequences,
Yeah.
of urban renewal.
Right.
Like it was supposed to improve the city, but it ended up having these, devastating and long-lasting negative impacts on these communities.
Exactly. And it really begs the question, who gets to define progress, whose voices are actually heard, and who ends up actually benefiting from these massive projects?
Right. And, someone listening to this might be saying, well, what does a highway to nowhere have to do with a revitalization project like Station East?
Yeah.
Like at first they seem completely different.
Yeah, they do. But when you look closer, you actually start to see some pretty interesting parallels.
Okay, well, let's do that. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about Station East.
Yeah.
You've been looking into this project. It was considered a success story at first.
Yeah, on the surface, it did seem like a really positive example of urban revitalization. It was this public-private partnership trying to, really transform this neighborhood near Johns Hopkins Hospital. And it was full of vacant lots. It had seen better days. And the idea was to attract, young black professionals, provide some affordable home ownership opportunities, really improve the overall quality of life in the area.
Yeah, and it seems like initially there was a lot of optimism. People were really excited about it. The articles talk about residents like Shauna Fredericks, Jeremy Brown, Stephanie Thomas Turbans, Jillian Smith, Nicholas Miles, all these folks who were really eager to buy homes in Station East.
Right. And, for them, it was a chance to build equity, become part of this, revitalized community, contribute to, positive change in their neighborhood.
Yeah, but as we know, things didn't quite go as planned. That initial excitement, kind of gave way to frustration for a lot of residents.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. Despite all promises, pretty soon after move in, a lot of these residents started having problems with their homes.
Like what kind of problems?
Oh, leaky roofs, flooding basements, shoddy construction, just, a lot of issues.
And it wasn't just the physical problems with the homes, right? It was also the sense that the developers just weren't listening to the residents' concerns.
Yeah, a lot of residents felt like their complaints were just falling on deaf ears, like they were being ignored, and it started to feel like they'd been taken advantage of.
Yeah, I remember reading a quote from Jeremy Brown. He said, "If I knew what I know now back then, I definitely would have chosen someplace else." I mean, it seems like a lot of residents felt that way, like they were misled by the developers.
Yeah, and then on top of all that, you had this controversy about the historic preservation tax credits, which added another layer of complexity to the whole story.
Right. Can you explain how those tax credits worked and why they became such a point of contention?
Sure. So basically, to encourage developers to, rehab these historic buildings, they can get these pretty significant tax breaks. And in the case of Station East, the developers used this pass-through system where the homeowners were the ones technically claiming those tax credits on their individual homes.
So instead of the developers claiming it for the whole project, they passed it on to the individual homeowner.
Exactly. And on paper, it seemed like a win-win. Homeowners get a big tax break. The developers get to, reduce their overall costs.
But it sounds like it didn't really work out that way.
No, not for everyone. A lot of residents found themselves in these really complicated financial situations because of claiming those tax credits. And some even ended up owing money to the IRS.
Wow. So they thought they were getting a good deal, but it ended up backfiring.
Yeah, and then there were all these questions about transparency. Like, did the homeowners really understand what they were getting into? Did they know about the potential risks of claiming those credits?
So it sounds like there's a parallel here with the highway to nowhere,
Hmm.
right? Like both of these projects ended up hurting the very communities they were supposed to be helping.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In both cases, we see these well-intentioned development projects having these unintended negative consequences, especially when there's a lack of transparency, community engagement, and accountability.
And both stories really highlight the power dynamics at play in urban development, right? Like how these dynamics can often leave marginalized communities, shouldering most of the burden.
Exactly. I mean, the highway to nowhere displaced thousands of residents, mostly Black families, to build a highway they never even finished. And then Station East, while, initially it was presented as this revitalization effort for this existing Black community, it ended up leaving some residents feeling exploited and burdened with these unexpected financial challenges.
Yeah, both projects really raise these serious questions about who benefits from development and who pays the price. And it's clear that in both of these cases, those costs were disproportionately borne by Black communities.
Right, and these stories really underscore the need for a more equitable and community-driven approach to development, one that really puts the needs and well-being of all residents first, not just the people with power and influence.
So I've talked about the leaky roofs, the broken promises, the tax credit controversy at Station East, but there's another layer to this story that I want to get into, and that's the emotional toll all of this has taken on the residents. You were saying earlier that some residents at Station East felt like they were taken advantage of.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, beyond just the physical problems with the homes and the financial issues, with the tax credits, there's this really deep sense of betrayal that runs through this whole Station East story. These residents, like Shauna Fredericks, they put all their hopes and dreams into these homes. They saw them as a way to, build a better future for themselves and their families. And to have that dream, shattered by leaky roofs, flooding basements, developables who don't seem to care, it's just incredibly disheartening.
Yeah, it's like a violation of trust almost,
Exactly.
Like they put their faith in these developers and the system, and it all kind of blows up in their face.
Yeah, and that feeling, that disillusionment of having your hopes dashed, it can have these really long-lasting impacts on both individuals and the entire community.
Right. And I remember Stephanie Thomas said something like, "We're all young. We're all minorities. We're all professionals." And this was an opportunity to have a slice of the pie to all become homeowners. At first there's that sense of pride and optimism, but then it just goes south so quickly.
Yeah, it's a really powerful quote. And it just highlights how much emotional weight this story carries. These residents weren't just looking for a place to live, they were looking for a place to belong, to build a future. And when that future turns into a nightmare, it's got to be so hard to deal with.
Yeah. So we've talked about the physical problems with the homes, the financial mess with the tax credits, and now this emotional layer of, betrayal and disillusionment. I mean, it seems like the Station East story is really about the human cost of development gone wrong.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. It's important to remember that, we're not just talking about abstract issues here. We're talking about people's lives, and their stories deserve to be heard.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? I mean, what can we do to prevent these kinds of situations from happening again in the future?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And there's no easy answer. But I think a big part of it is shifting our focus from just building things to building communities.
What do you mean by that? Building communities instead of just buildings.
I mean, really putting the needs and well-being of the residents front and center throughout the entire development process, making sure that communities have a real voice in shaping what happens in their own neighborhoods, and holding developers accountable for their promises, making sure they're building homes that are safe, affordable, and, built to last.
So it's about moving away from that top-down approach, you know,
Mm,
where a few people make all the decisions, and instead moving towards something more collaborative, more community-driven.
exactly. Yeah, it's about recognizing that development isn't just about bricks and mortar. It's about people's lives, their homes, their communities.
Right, and that brings us back to the idea of equity, which has been a theme throughout our discussion of both Station East and the Highway to Nowhere. So how do we actually make sure that development is equitable, that it benefits everyone in the community?
Yeah, that's the key question. And it requires us to think about the historical context and the power dynamics that already exist in our cities. We need to be aware of how development decisions can either reinforce those patterns or challenge them.
Right, like with the Highway to Nowhere, we saw how a project that was supposed to improve transportation ended up displacing and disenfranchising mostly Black communities.
Right.
And with Station East, we saw how a project marketed as an opportunity for Black homeownership ended up creating all these unexpected burdens and this sense of betrayal for a lot of residents.
Yeah, exactly. And these stories really highlight how important it is to have more transparency, accountability, and community engagement in every single aspect of urban development.
So what does that actually look like? How can we make sure that development is more equitable and more community-driven?
Well, one thing is to really prioritize community benefits agreements. These are legally binding contracts between developers and community organizations that lay out specific benefits that the community will get in exchange for their support of a project.
So it's about negotiating upfront to make sure that the community actually benefits from the development.
Exactly, not just hoping for the best. And these benefits can be all sorts of things: affordable housing units, job training programs, investments in local businesses, improvements to parks and public spaces.
So community benefits agreements can be a powerful tool to make sure that development is a win-win for both the developers and the community.
Yeah, they definitely can be. But we also have to remember that they're not a magic solution. It takes constant vigilance and advocacy to make sure that those agreements are actually enforced and that the benefits that were promised are actually delivered.
Right, and it's not just about these agreements, it's also about making sure that residents have more opportunities to participate in the decision-making process
Right.
from the very beginning.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond just informing communities about projects. We
Yeah.
need to actively engage them in shaping how those projects are designed and implemented.
So that means creating more avenues for community input, public hearing surveys, community design workshops, all sorts of ways for people to have their voices heard.
Exactly. And it means making sure that those opportunities are accessible to everyone in the community, regardless of, language barriers or tech access or physical limitations.
It sounds like we need a fundamental shift in the way we think about urban development,
Yeah.
one that prioritizes equity community engagement,
Mm.
and a more holistic understanding of what it takes to build these thriving, sustainable cities that work for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful point. And these stories from Baltimore, while they're specific to that city, they offer valuable lessons for cities all across the country. They remind us that development isn't just about building things, it's about building communities. And that requires a commitment to justice, equity, and a deep respect for the people who call these cities home.
Well said. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Sounds good.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation. I hope our listeners have learned a bit more about how complex urban development really is, and why it's so important to advocate for cities that are more equitable and sustainable.
Me too. And hopefully they feel inspired to learn more, get involved in their own communities, and help create a better future for everyone.
Absolutely. So for anyone who wants to dive deeper into these topics, we've got some additional resources in the show notes.
Yeah, be sure to check out the full articles on Station East and the Highway to Nowhere. And we've also included some other resources on equitable development and community organizing in Baltimore.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.